Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. For those of you who might have missed the introduction, I'm Charlie Keil, the principal of Innis College, and we will be engaged in conversation with Director Alan Taylor in just a moment. Before I introduce Alan, I just want to acknowledge that some people might have had trouble seeing the beginning of the film, and we're aware of that. It was a new platform issue, and so we are working on how to make the beginning of the film, and possibly the rest of it if you want to see the entirety again, available to those people who were so adversely affected. And more details will be communicated to you because, of course, we have your contact information by virtue of having registered for the event. So we do apologize for that, but let's move on to happier elements, and that would be our conversation with Alan. So hi, Alan. I'm going to do a formal introduction, but nice to see you.
Hi, Charlie. Thank you for doing this.
Sure. So Alan Taylor is an award-winning director, screenwriter, and producer. He graduated with high distinction from the University of Toronto, no mean feat in and of itself, and then received an MA in Modern European History from Columbia University, and then, if that weren't enough, an MFA in Film Studies from New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. His first feature film, Palookaville, received the award for Best First Feature at the Venice Film Festival. And since then, he's gone on to make such films as The Emperor's New Clothes, Kill the Poor, Thor: The Dark World, Terminator Genesis, and as you just saw, his most recent film, The Many Saints of Newark. In television, now this is where you need to hold on to your hats. Alan won an Emmy for directing The Sopranos, and also a DGA, that's the Directors Guild of America, if you don't know your acronyms, award for the pilot of Mad Men. And I would say that if we're in a television renaissance, then Alan has been involved with many of the pivotal series that have helped establish that as a fact of viewing. He has directed episodes of the following: Homicide: Life on the Street, Oz, West Wing, 6 Feet Under, Sex and the City, Carnival, Deadwood, Lost, Rome. You might think he only chooses films with very brief, or TV shows with very brief titles, but Big Love, but there's some Bored to Death, there you go, and Boardwalk Empire. He was a recurring director and executive producer on a show you might have heard of called Game of Thrones. We're gonna ask Alan later about his future projects, so I'll just end this introduction by saying he resides in Brooklyn and in rural Pennsylvania with his 3 children and a rescued dog named Nasa. Am I pronouncing the dog's name correct?
You are.
Correctly.
He's curled up in the corner, yes.
Okay, all right. So, Alan, this is a kind of a 6 degrees of separation question to start off with. You and I graduated from Victoria College in the same year with similar degrees. I'm now a film studies professor, and you're a world-famous director. What did I do wrong?
What did you do right? You've got a lot more job security, and you get to take your, sabbaticals occasionally. I was committed to the academic life for a long time. I mean, as my resume seems to suggest, I tried to stay in school as long as I possibly could. I intended to become a history professor. I fell in love with history, studying history at U of T, and then I went to Columbia to continue, and then had a kind of panic attack about academia and fled, and didn't flee that far because I ran into another school. I ran to NYU to go to study filmmaking. But the thing that had always been sort of an imaginary, impossible dream, which was to be a director, I got to a point where I just felt like I had to try it, and that led to NYU.
So I guess that you haven't thought that maybe all you should make is historical epics.
No, but when I left Columbia to go to NYU, I thought I would make just historical movies. I would make documentaries. I thought I would just channel my love of history into filmmaking. And there were some documentary makers that were blowing my mind at the time. And I thought, yes, I can do that. And then I got into film school, and storytelling and narrative and stuff just took over my head. And I woke up doing fictional movies.
Do you want to say a little bit about your film at NYU that ended up, I assume, in some ways concretizing for you the fact that this was realizable, that you've got recognition for that film? Just tell people a little bit maybe about how that part of it worked for you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a million ways into directing, and there are many people who don't go to film school. I was very grateful to go to film school. I think school worked for me. I liked sort of having a structured environment. But my final thesis project really did do all the things you sort of wish it would do. I remember it was a short film about basically breaking up with my girlfriend, and I finished it and thought, okay, I've made something no one's ever going to watch. And then it just took on a life of its own, and it won ridiculous numbers of awards, and it got me my first feature and my first TV job. So I came away. I really do believe that if people want to direct, doing a short is still one of the best ways to get in. It's a chance to do something that's in your voice, that sort of shows what you want to do. And it may be, and in some ways it was for me, the last chance you get to do that. There are some ways in which that film is still the most personal thing I've ever done, and also the most probably successful thing I've ever done. It changed my life.
So I noticed, I did a little bit of research, and I noticed that your first two television assignments, at least, were multiple episodes in two Canadian series, Catwalk and Traitors.
Oh man, that's not even on my IMDb page. You did do research.
And I don't know, for those of you of a certain age, this is not going to go down the Brian Linehan rabbit hole, but was obviously you didn't stay within the Canadian industry, and your degree came from an American film school. But can you tell us how it is that you started with Canadian television production, and then what occasioned the shift? Because then I think some of the early work you did was like Homicide. So well, clearly
it was a weird hopscotch, because I had grown up in Canada. I went to school in Canada. Then I moved to New York. When my short film came out, the first job that got me was Homicide, actually. Barry Levinson saw it and gave me an episode of Homicide. And after I did Homicide, then I did the two shows you mentioned, which I have great affection for. Traitors, I still know some of the people on that show, and I still have fond memories. The other one has been expunged from my I hate bringing it up. But the funny thing was that, at that point, I was just out of film school, and if anybody offered me any job, I took it and was so grateful. And I think I was, moderately shiny because I just done Homicide, which was getting some attention. So I became so hireable. And so the next two jobs were in Canada, but then I was still living in New York, and I just continued on after that, doing mostly American productions, because that's where I was at the time.
So I imagine that most people aren't overly familiar with the differences between directing episodic television and directing feature films. Obviously, the main thing would be, you get to direct either. Can you elaborate a bit on what the differences are between directing for the one medium, and especially now that television is seen more and more as a kind of writer/showrunners medium, whereas we still kind of hold to this notion that film is a director's medium. Can you tell us about the different roles you play, because you've had such prominent projects in both of these mediums?
Yeah, I thought about this a lot, because I think the ground was shifting under my feet constantly, as I was beginning to work. And, what people refer to as the golden age of television, American television anyway, was rising up. And I just happened to be there at the time. I came out of film school, all my heroes were independent filmmakers, and that's all I wanted to do. And I thought TV was stupid, because this was the 90s and TV was stupid. And then these things were coming that were sort of taking my breath away. The pilot for Homicide was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. And then the pilot for Sopranos was unlike anything I'd seen on TV. So television started to beckon at exactly the same time that independent films were getting harder and harder to make at that point. The financing model that had supported Jim Jarmusch and other people that were sort of my heroes at the time was kind of collapsing. So I wound up going back and forth between them. And there's a huge difference between being an episodic director and being the director of a standalone project. Being an episodic is a real tough school. You have to come in, the train's already moving, you have to jump in, learn the language. If you're arrogant at all, you sort of try and lift it up a little bit if you can, but you basically have to sort of learn to speak different languages that you inherit. Obviously, it's the opposite of the creative process when you're doing a standalone thing. And so I was grateful to learn on episodic. It's like doing it's like being in the Roger Corman school of filmmaking, where you just sort of grind it out. You have no time and no money. But I also know it sort of damages one, I think, as an artist. You learn efficient ways of shooting, but they aren't the most creative ways of shooting. And also, this is something else that dawned on me. I mean, the episodic process, you're shooting in a way that the big decisions can be made later, usually in rooms that you're not even in as a director. So there's a premium on shooting coverage, which means, shooting things where there's many ways to cut it together, because that means showrunners and producers can make a decision later. All the great filmmakers don't do that. They distill a scene down to one shot or two shots that can only go together in the ways they conceive them. And so I think they're very different activities. I would say that there's a big shift going on, which is that television is becoming more cinematic, and at least mainstream American movies are becoming more episodic. So I think they're sort of starting to the barriers are dissolving, which is kind of interesting for directors now. I think one of the best mediums around is the limited series that directors can do all of, and it's sort of like an extended novelistic feature in a way. That's a new medium, and it's very exciting for directors, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting.
Long answer, but this is
no. But it's interesting you mentioned that, because there have been, certain directors who have established themselves, I guess, in film, and then became associated with the very sort of thing you're talking about. What might have been conceived of as a limited series, you can think of, even though they might have turned into extended series down the road. But David Fincher was as much a name associated with Mindhunter, and then this is terrible. Valet was associated with Big Little Lies for the.
There's a history that goes back, because Homicide was a unique new show, and Barry Levinson was just a filmmaker, and he did that. And David Lynch was ahead of everybody in taking a kind of a cinematic, artistic voice and putting it into television with Twin Peaks a million years ago.
I thought it was maybe David Lynch, and he was letting you.
I wish. I've spoken to him, but no, he's not here right now. So.
One more question, maybe, about your toggling between film and TV, and then we'll get into the matter at hand, which is this particular film. What is it like to be working on sort of films that are part of an extended filmic universe? I mean, in the case of both the Thor film and Terminator Genesis, you're dealing with what people would call franchises, in a sense, right?
Yeah. And that I just got a note from somebody who's a friend of mine who's in the audience, who's saying they can't hear me. So I'm going to try and speak louder.
Okay.
If anybody, sorry,
I can hear you. I don't know if I know that's not. I'm not the only person who matters here, but I'm having no trouble.
I'll do my best. Yeah, that's what I meant in saying that mainstream American movies are becoming more episodic. That I had two experiences in the franchise world, and they wound up being not my favorite experiences. I didn't have a good time. But I think there's an art to that factory, and I really admire some filmmakers that can make that factory work for them, who can step in and do this seemingly impossible thing of serving the factory but also keeping their own personal voice. I felt like I did not get a chance to do that on the two chances I had, but Taika Waititi, who came in to do the next Thor, I thought, did a brilliant thing of combining his sensibility with the demands of the factory, so that it can be done. I think, a huge part of any creative process is just trying to be in the right place for you. And I had to make a painful decision that multi-million-dollar blockbusters were maybe not where I belonged. I still feel, protective of them. We worked hard. I love the cast. I like to mention as often as possible that my Terminator was the second highest grossing Terminator of all time. So there, but no, it was a tough chapter for me. And in fact, I've been sort of having to sort of recover from those things to find out what it is I love about filmmaking again ever since. And I feel like I've sort of found my way back again. And this movie was part of that process, was finding a movie that is part of, again, a franchise in a way. But I felt like I belonged in this one.
So I'll just say, if anyone is having a difficulty hearing Alan, again, I am not. I think this speaks to the degree to which he is a quiet authority on a set, because my conversations with Alan, I've never known him to be the loudest voice in the room by any stretch. So you might want to just turn your volume up a bit, because I have a feeling this is as loud as it gets. with Alan.
I can start, I'm sure you can say some things to upset me. Start talking about Catwalk again, and I'll get louder and louder.
So let's talk a bit about the origins of this particular film. It's not unique in being a prequel of an established series, but it is not the most common way of, let's say, extending the life of a well-established and well-loved series. I mean, clearly there wasn't going to be any kind of conventional sequel for the very fact that James Gandolfini, died after the end of The Sopranos as a series. And I don't think, from what I've read, David Chase had no interest. David Chase, for those who might not recognize the name, I don't know how that would be possible, but is the creative force behind The Sopranos. Had no interest, as far as I know, in simply, pushing the series ahead, just in a conventional sense of like, what are they up to? Now 5 years.
It was complicated in a couple of ways, partly by Jim passing away, but also those who know the show, it ended on such a note of dark ambiguity that David
literally dark ambiguity.
People hitting their TV sets. People were, David was committed to never answering that question, so he couldn't go forward in time. And I think it took him a long time, years, to realize that he had a story he wanted to tell that took place in the same universe but prior. He is an artist and he does things for reasons that only he understands. I think it was that he had a few memories from his childhood, a few memories of that period of unrest with the rebellion in Newark. And also some things about this character Dickie that he thought about, and they just sort of came together. That was a story he wanted to tell.
Now, I've read a few accounts of how it is that, I mean, again, I don't make it sound like I'm too much of a nerd in terms of doing homework here, but I recognize that you, I think, have directed the fourth largest number of Sopranos episodes. So arguably there were three directors ahead of you in terms of familiarity. But you were the one who was chosen. So maybe could you let people know how it is that you came to be attached to the film as the director?
Yeah, and to be fair, one of those directors, John Patterson, was there at the beginning, and he passed away. So he wasn't available. It's funny. The call came out of the blue from David, and I wasn't. I was very happy, but I was unsure why. And then when we were sort of partway through the shoot, he said that I had directed some of his favorite episodes and that I was the director that gave him the most trouble.
That's exactly what I read.
Well, I probably said it before because I was so struck by that. And I think I know what he's referring to, but I'm not entirely sure. And I just liked the idea that he figured it was worth it or something. That I guess he didn't think he was getting a yes man, but he got somebody he was willing to collaborate with again. And it was a good collaboration. On the show, he was kind of in an ivory tower of the showrunner, and it was a different dynamic. But on this movie, it was much more an active partnership. So it was positive.
So I'm going to artfully, now, of course, by exposing the artfulness, it won't be so artful anymore. I'm going to artfully integrate some pre-submitted questions at this stage because they sort of flow naturally from what we've just been talking about, which is that people are curious about the kinds of challenges that are presented by returning to a property that you're already familiar with as a director. But now if we think back to what you talked about, it being a showrunner's show and you coming in as a kind of, director, not for hire so much, but only doing a limited number of episodes. Rotating. And now you are steering this is a ship, right? This is the standalone. And now you are in charge in quite a different way. So can you talk about the adjustments involved there?
Yeah, one of them sort of goes to what I was saying before. In shooting the series, you were very aware that at some point what you shot was going to be seen by David, and it was going to have to work for him as well as for yourself. And then if that wasn't enough, there was always a writer on set who was a little bit afraid of David, whose job was to make sure it was going in the right direction. The show, like most TV shows, was shot in the sort of familiar way of coverage with the usual number of shots, wides and 2 shots and singles. One of the biggest differences on doing the movie was there wasn't a distance between me and David, and so I could do things that you should be able to do. I was, some of the scenes are oneers, as we call them. It's, a single shot covers the whole scene. when you get to the editing room, you have no options whatsoever, except to maybe pick a take. So that was for me, a more fulfilling way to shoot, a more fulfilling way to sort of render the scenes, more fun to work with the actors that way. And it would have been really not done on the TV show because you couldn't sort of, you couldn't narrow the choices down the road.
Right. Did you have any kind of trepidation? I mean, when you were approached, did you have a moment of saying, I'm not sure this is something I want to take on? For a number of reasons. Some people have mentioned, the expectations would be so high. You're resurrecting a really revered property. Maybe the idea of returning to a well that you're not sure you can see the capacity of the reservoir.
Right. It's funny. I didn't feel any limitation in the world. I was really grateful to get back into the Sopranos way of storytelling. Having been out in the wilderness of plot-driven things for a while, it was nice to get back to a show that is almost entirely concerned with theme and character and all that grown-up stuff. That doesn't mean it's stuffy. It's quite funny and perverse too, but it's just a sort of different way of storytelling. So I was eager to get back to that. I was lots of trepidation. Part of it was, am I going to do this in a way that it's going to be okay for David? There's that usual thing. Also, I had a complicated thing that I had just agreed to do the Deadwood movie, which was another sort of spin-off from a series, from an HBO series. And I love David Milch, who wrote that. And so I had this agonizing, very luxurious problem, but I had to pick between the two because they were going to happen at the same time. Yeah. And I hummed and hawed and stalled and finally went with Sopranos. And I think it was partly that I felt more personally integrated in that world. I spent more time there. It was a voice I thought I knew.
Yeah.
But yes, trepidation or whatever the word was you used. I spend a lot of time with trepidation.
The one question that's just come up recently, and I think it fits into this mode of questioning too, is the degree to which you can have that element of self-expression as a director with a preformed universe. It's slightly different than, showrunners are the ones who ultimately control, what moment gets. It's more about this is an established world, and you have to find your way through that world in order to impose whatever kind of vision you have for that world. Especially again onto a movie, which is not running along the same track as a show.
You can talk about movies that are a series because they're so common, or you can talk about TV series, and it's the same dilemma. It is funny. There is a lot of range. I think you sometimes the languages are locked in. I remember I was directing Sex and the City and Sopranos at the same time, and they couldn't have two more different languages. And I remember once shooting a shot on Sopranos that was really more of a Sex and the City shot, and David caught it and he said, what is this? And he was like, it was a little too snappy and clever and zingy, the kind of thing you would do on Sex and the City, but not on Sopranos. So there are very different rules but the Marvel movies are, an example, or even, I suppose the Batman movies that you can go into the same territory, the same mythology, but people do want to see some shift. They want to see something new in the telling. People seem to have an endless appetite to see the same stories over and over again, so long as they feel like they're getting some shift in how it's rendered or portrayed. And I am happy with that because, you said earlier, and it has been true for a long time, that television is the realm of the writer, the showrunner, and movies are the realm of the director. But that too, I think, is dissolving. And I think more audiences expect more cinematic qualities in their television. They notice how it looks. They're picking up on director things now. In the old days, it used to be, cover the dialogue. Now, I think, much of the pleasure of people loving shows, Euphoria is as much a director experience as it is a writer experience for people, I think. So I always appreciate it when director stuff gets noticed.
Yeah, I mean, and it's exactly. And then when we say that television is becoming more cinematic, that is acknowledging the contribution of the director, even if the directors may change over the course of the episodes, because that can't come just through the writing, right?
Right, and it's saying how you stage it, how you visualize it is as important a part of the experience as the words on the page. And And it's, it's hard for people to shift. I know some writers still, it makes them, jittery. What they really want to do is see a radio play, filmed with close-ups of all the dialogue. Everything else makes them worried. But I think we're all evolving, and it's I think television is benefiting.
Do you think, just thinking about the way that this film kind of manifested itself, and by that I mean in a 2-hour format, with a lot of new characters, and then some characters realized in an earlier aged form, let's say. Right. But knowing that this is as much, I think, a challenge for you as it would be for the writer, that you don't have that luxury of pulling these characters through a multi-episode arc, that this is a 2-hour format to realize a narrative vision. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to what that means to you as a director. I mean, the challenge is already there for the writer, but then there's another challenge for you, because this is it. This is how it's going to play itself out, right?
Yeah, and which in many ways is such a relief and so satisfying, easier in a way, because you have at least, you hope you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so it starts to talk to you about how to shoot it, because you understand the structure, and you're serving that structure. With an open-ended thing, it's a little less clear, I think. Yeah, I mean, I was just grateful. And that's why I think the limited run series is a great invention, because it's got duration, but it's not open-ended. So you can be, you can think of it in terms of beginning, middle, and end. You can think of it in Aristotelian,
Yeah.
So I was mostly grateful. It's two different art forms. It's like a novel as opposed to a short story. So, and they're both fun to read. So obviously, they have different structural expectations.
Just building on that, I wonder what the appeal was to you in being able to. Obviously, this is set in a different time frame, and the ability to. I'm still drawn to historical things. Yeah. So this ability to recreate 60s, 70s Newark, and what kinds of contributions you felt you could make to that, and if you maybe give people a little detail of what what does a director do in order to, because a lot of the critics were quite complimentary about the way in which there was this very careful attention to the nuances of life in that time period.
Yeah, I mean, partly it starts with David, because it's really important to him to nail the reality of things. When we were shooting the TV show, we had to shoot everything in New Jersey. You were not allowed to shoot anywhere else. The movie we actually shot half in New Jersey and half in New York to get period things. But again, it's really important to feel like you're telling the truth. And in this movie, besides that usual obligation, we were taking on, the rebellion of that summer. And portraying racial tensions and blowing up into riots and fires. And we started the movie, and then George Floyd happened, and that those issues came roaring up. And it was already important. It became even more important to if we, mostly a bunch of white guys, are going to be telling the story, the bar is really high to try and be accurate and try and get it right. And so I did tons of research. There's almost not a single image in the portrayal of the riots that isn't taken from a source at the time. There's a kid that we see get shot that was taken from a famous case where the kid actually survived, thank goodness, but it was a crossfire. We shot about 2 blocks from where the main violence was. And I remember we were setting up our main set, this intersection, and people who had lived there all their lives were coming out and looking at it. And I saw a woman with tears in her eyes, and she said she'd been there as a girl, and it looked exactly like this. That was just one of the things that made me think, okay, we're getting it right. We really have to get it right. And yeah, that's mostly the director's obligation, but working with a great production designer, Bob Shaw, and DP, and then Leslie Odom Jr., who played Harold, sort of having to carry the weight of that whole storyline and be truthful with it and give it dimensionality when he's only one story of many. He has to make sure that his story stands up against all the rest. So, yeah.
How much input did you have into the casting? Because there was, of course, a lot of ink spilled about the choice of James Gandolfini's son to play the younger Tony. And then I have another casting question, but maybe you could talk to that first.
Well, David and I cast together, and we didn't cast anybody. That we had to be unanimous for us to cast anybody, and it was. He had thought of Michael early on, but hadn't mentioned it at all. And we were looking at everybody, in New York and Chicago and LA, trying to find somebody who could play that role. And then we just the idea just sort of started gravitating towards the center of our consciousness. And I was nervous because I had never seen him act before. And I was also nervous to ask this young man to go into this. I mean, he was present when his father passed away. He'd never seen the show, and to sort of say, okay, put yourself inside your father's character is a huge amount to ask. I heard since then that Michael, when he was first asked, said, hell no. He was like, no way. And then after a few weeks, he came back around and wanted to do it. And when I met him, he clearly wanted to do it. So we auditioned him, and he was really, really good, and brought qualities that were both his father and also his own sort of younger, more sensitive self. And the story I've told before, but right before we started shooting, we had a cast dinner, and Michael got up and said he wanted to thank everybody for giving him a chance to say hello to his dad again and goodbye again. And everybody teared up, and it was clear that whatever happened, luckily he did a great performance, but whatever happened, it felt like the right thing to do for the movie.
Right.
And so every other casting choice was unanimous. Some we argued over more than others. The hardest one to cast was Dickie, the main character, I think.
That's what I was going to ask about.
Yeah. Just because he had to do so much. I mean, he's a Sopranos leading man, so he has to be funny, sexy, dangerous, crazy, sociopathic, but you have to root for him. And it's a very hard thing to pull off. Alessandro put himself on tape, and David and I watched it, and his work was so good that it was almost dangerous, because I sort of fell in love with his audition. A few times when we were shooting, I was sort of trying to say, okay, do it like he did in the audition. And we had lunch with him, and he's got an Italian family, and it just seemed finally like it was easy to go with him.
Yeah,
casting Ray Liotta was the other thing that was funny and interesting, because we met him, we had lunch with him, and he's great, but you're taking on a huge dose of Scorsese world when you
right.
bring him into a gangster movie. And I thought part of my job was to try and make sure that this was its own flavor of gangster movie, and that meant sort of pushing the things that make David's voice a little different. And to me, part of David's voice is that it sometimes strays into the surreal, into the sort of dreamy, into things that you're not quite sure they're real or not. And we cast Ray, but the thing that made me happy was that we were casting him in this very strange way, where he was playing one character and then another character, which made it feel like, okay, you know him from Scorsese, but this is something that only Sopranos would do. And in my mind, there's a way to watch this movie where the whole second character maybe never existed, and is in Dickie's head or something, because he needs a father figure, and that slightly off quality is something that I think David Chase's writing invites.
Yeah, and I can imagine that people watching the film for the first time probably did a bit of a double take, because they're probably thinking, is that Ray Liotta again?
There's a danger. I'm sure everybody goes clunk, for like a minute, they fall out of the movie, and then luckily I think his performance is so consistent that you come back into the movie again.
Yeah, but all I'll say about Nivola is once you've seen it, it's hard to imagine any other actor in that role. Like, he's so not just nails it, but so inhabits that, as you say, extremely difficult character to portray, because there's such a range.
You've got to laugh with him. You've got to laugh at him. He has to be sexy. And there's one of my favorite scenes, or some of my favorite scenes are the simplest ones. There's one where he's sitting on the bed with young Tony, played by William Ludwig, and they're just talking. And every little nuance in Alessandro's voice is there's a lot of variety going on. But it's just two guys sitting on a bed talking, but he's really doing a wonderful performance. It's one of my regrets is that he didn't get any attention, award attention or anything. I think he really deserves something for the range of things he was doing. And it's his first time really carrying a movie.
Well, I agree. not that it's so great. He's got my seal of approval thing. Well, that's all that matters.
Yeah, I'll tell him. I'm going to call him afterwards and say that you said so.
One person had quite a simple question. They want to know what the significance of the title is.
Oh, okay. That's pretty easy. Dickie Moltisanti, who was Christopher Moltisanti's father. Moltisanti in Italian means many saints. And so literally this is the story of this family, the Many Saints of Newark. But, I had to do some work thinking about what the movie meant. And it's really about one thing. It's about people striving to reinvent themselves. It's the American idea that you can change your destiny. Every single character is trying to change their destiny, and they all fail because it's a Sopranos movie, except for Harold. Harold is actually the only one who's going to sort of change the life that was written for him. But all those characters who are striving and trying to be their better selves or their imagined selves, there's something kind of sad and somehow the saint imagery appealed to me. And so there are various halos hidden throughout the movie. There's almost every major character gets a halo at some point through some visual. Harold gets the best one at the nightclub. He's got so sort of echoing the words, but it basically comes down to just the name.
Okay. There's a few. We're gonna just go a few more minutes. There's a few kind of forward-looking questions here. A few coming from me, and a few coming from the audience. The first one is, given you've mentioned your preference for or let's say the appeal of the limited series. Someone wants to know this is one of those. What's your favorite limited series that you weren't involved in?
That's funny. I don't know if I have a favorite one I wasn't involved with. I'm dying to get my hands on the medium. True Detective. I sort of think of a million years ago, Twin Peaks as being the original one, even though it ran for sort of 2 seasons. It was really sort of always designed as a limited run thing. No, it's a basic question. I don't have a good answer to it. I just I see other directors doing it. When Soderbergh did The Knick, again, that ran for 2 seasons, but really felt like a limited run show. It's just the idea that one director's voice can shape the whole thing. And I missed many of the ones that got celebrated, like Mayor of
Easttown.
Easttown.
Hey, that was on HBO. You should know this. You've got a very strong association with HBO.
Yeah, I think I get a free subscription or something.
So speaking of HBO and HBO Max, someone asked I'm going to read this question. I haven't done this yet, but what are your thoughts on the rise of streaming services like Netflix, HBO Max, Disney Plus? How does having your content on these streaming services change your creative process? And how did this affect your work on Many Saints? And I'm not quite sure, because Many Saints ended up being on HBO Max, but it wasn't originally conceived of being on HBO Max. That was a Warner Brothers decision based on COVID, right? Yeah,
there's a lot of things going on in that question. It's a great question because it sort of defines the landscape we're working in right now. The movie, Warner Brothers bought the rights from HBO to do the movie, and so it was going to be just a silver screen movie, and David Chase was committed to doing big screen movie. And then, as you say, COVID came along, and we were releasing just about the time people were not sure they wanted to go back to the movies, and we were realizing that our demographic, was older viewers, and they were the ones who really weren't sure they wanted to.
Yeah, exactly.
Also, there's some shenanigans going on that Warner Brothers is part of a huge corporation that was trying to launch HBO Max and wanted to make sure it had sort of hot properties on, so it was good for them to have something to put on. What wound up happening is that it got released simultaneously on streaming and on theaters. The box office reflected that and was, dismal by usual standards. Apparently, it was soaring on HBO, and very happy. But that's virtually invisible. Nobody publishes. You see box office for the theaters, you don't see it published for HBO. So it was a bit of a disappointment to sort of see it it came out feeling like it was sort of limping when it came out, even because of that release strategy. But in terms of how it changes you creatively, to me, it doesn't change the process of creating at all. But it still remains to be seen whether this is a great thing or a not great thing.
Yeah.
But there's just, sometimes I go on Netflix and it's just dreary. It's it's just too much, and no one's going to watch a lot of it, and so I think for me and for a lot of people, it's still a question in the air as to what the impact's going to be on our.
But if I can just push on that question a little bit more, though, I mean, some have made the case that the very success of services like Netflix have given them the luxury. Some might argue it's not a luxury; it's a very calculated decision, but nonetheless, have given them the luxury of being able to give hefty budgets to auteurs who want to do personal projects. And I think the most obvious one was Roma, right? Like that Coron would not have been able to make Roma because of the kind of niche nature of it. But Netflix, desperately wanted a best film Oscar, and Roma was their, probably most people thought was going to be their pathway.
What's a little chilling is that all this stuff is incredibly calculated and algorithm driven, and they're mostly driven by viewer numbers and viewing seconds that are being counted. But yes, they still want a category for the award winner. And so this year it's
Power of the Dog.
Yeah. And that movie would not have gotten made anywhere else. Campion says so herself. And so, great that they're able to bankroll things like that. But those are very few. I mean, they'll do one or two of those. And the rest are anything with Channing Tatum where things blow up, or there's an algorithm that says if you put these two names and this, it's a no-brainer, and I think that's driving. And there's this kind of middle range of kind of blah movie. I guess it's like the old B movies, from the old days, but that's sort of that Netflix is kind of full of. So yes, A Power of the Dog comes along, Aroma, which I actually liked, but it's not a Miramax that used to do those things throughout the year. It's not or A24, which is a really wonderful distributor that's doing what the great independent, semi-independent studios used to do.
Yeah, I think the only thing that was wrong with your algorithm is I think it's actually Ryan Reynolds, not Channing Tatum, but nonetheless.
You're right. I think Channing Tatum still he's wishing.
So let's. I want to give the audience one last chance to ask any questions they might have, but I'm gonna I think wrap this up by just asking you to talk about your future projects, what you're working on right now, and what you are hoping to develop.
I'm always full of hope, and I'm always developing. Right now, most of my time is going into something that I'm actually enjoying more than I kind of thought I would. I've been in New Orleans doing the television adaptation of Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, which was a series of novels that I loved in my teens, I think, when I read them. And there was a movie that I actually think was a great movie by a great director, but it got some mixed response.
Neil Jordan, right?
Neil Jordan, yeah, great filmmaker. And so we're doing a TV series based on that, and it's part of AMC's hopes to sort of open up a kind of Anne Rice universe with not just that line of stories, but for other things as well. So that's taking up my time now. I'm directing the first couple and executive producing, but I have things I've been hoping for a while that you try and inch along. There's a script that I've written with some collaborators called Gold Mountain, which is historical, where Michelle Yeoh is supposed to play the lead, and it's based on a true story of a woman who was very successful in the bride trade during the gold rush, and it's my favorite project that we have right now. But it's proving to be challenging because I love history, but not every studio seems to. You get a lot of no period slamming the door in your face. So there's that, and I've got other TV things I'm developing, and a couple of movies I've been trying to make for a while. There's something that Netflix and I were gonna do before COVID slammed. And people might have mixed feelings about this idea, but I'm dying to do it. It's a movie based on For Whom the Bell Tolls, Hemingway's novel. And I had never been a huge Hemingway fan, and he's certainly problematic in a lot of ways. But reading the novel again, I'm just so in love with the bravery of what he did in terms of storytelling. And also, it's a good time to be telling rousing stories about fighting fascists. It seems like who knew that was going to be relevant again?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So that's something I'm still hoping will happen.
So I guess the last thing is, it's because you just said this now, I think you alluded to you've been working on it and developing the script. To my mind, you've had one film that you collaborate on the screenplay for, The Emperor's New Clothes.
I guess I got credit on that. I collaborated on the script on Palookaville as well.
Okay.
But I've never had like sole credit on anything. And
right. So is that something you want to, do you want to exercise that muscle more? Is that?
It's funny. It's been a long, bumpy road. When I came out of film school, all my heroes were writer directors. And so I wanted to be like them. And then I started working in television and met David Chase and David Milch and Matt Weiner and thought, oh, you guys actually know how to write. It's not just something you do because you think it's a cool idea. There's an actual high art going on. And I think I sort of got intimidated and backed away and thought, okay, I'll just direct. That's what I'll do. I still miss it. And one of the, I think we've all had a COVID experience where you discovered something that was actually a benefit of the COVID shutdown. And one was that I was able to write Gold Mountain, and I would never have taken the time to do it or trusted myself to do it if I didn't have that downtime. And it reminded me of how wonderful writing can be. It really is one of the great joys.
Oh, here's hoping you have more opportunity. Well, not because of COVID. Here's hoping you have more opportunities to write, but definitely keep directing because clearly you know what you're doing. You don't need my seal of approval.
No, but I'm going to tell Alessandro that you gave him the thumbs up. For,
I'm sure that'll buoy him for a good minute.
Well, you and I are both clinging to any positive feedback we can get. Still learning.
So if you can bear with me for just a minute, Alan, I'm going to just let our attendees know about 2 future events. This is one of the things I always do at the end. On Thursday, March 24th, we are initiating the new season of Writers on Writing, and our guest will be Kinesia Lubrin. And then on Thursday, April 21st, we will have the annual Innis Alumni Lecture, and our guest will be Vivek Krishnamurthy. And his talk will be on Can You Say That on the Internet? The Law and Politics of Online Content Moderation. So, tell Alessandro about that. Maybe he wants
sign me up.
That. So, but my happy duty right now is to just say great thanks to Alan Taylor for having a nice conversation with me about his career and the film that we all saw and enjoyed. And again, if you didn't get to see the whole thing, well, we'll try to remedy that, but it deserves seeing in its entirety.
Yes, I hope people get to see the beginning because it took us a long time to figure out how to start the movie, and so I'd like you to see how we started.
I heard that one failed attempt, or not attempt, one failed approach, not failed, one you discarded, I think is a better way to put it, was to have Carmela be involved.
Yeah, there was a bit of voiceover and storytelling that started the movie, and believe it or not, we tried it with 2 actors. We tried it with Tony Sirico playing Polly, and we tried it with Carmela, and eventually David threw it out and came up with a new beginning, which hopefully people will see at some point. Hero Criterion. And I think for him, that's when the movie sort of tied together, when he figured out how it was going to start. Finally. Yeah.
Well, congratulations. I know that the film was a huge success on streaming. And so a lot of people saw it, and that's what matters, right?
Yeah, that is, that's what it comes down to. I'm not a snob about big screen or small screen. I'm happy if people can see it. Ideally, they can see the whole thing.
And we're glad people saw this tonight, and particularly glad that they got to hear this illuminating. I won't say the conversation was necessarily illuminating. Your contributions to the conversation were illuminating.
I had a good time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thanks, everyone. Good night.